Good morning, church. When I was in 8th grade, I did what many 8th graders in Michigan do. I visited Washington, D.C. I know that Laura recently went with her students, and that got me to reminiscing about my own trip. Now, I don't have any pictures because this was in 2001, long before I had a digital camera or even a cell phone, and one of my friends accidentally opened my roll of film and ruined it. Not that I'm bitter about it over 2 decades later. Young generations have no idea what I'm talking about, by the way. But I took a lot of pictures. I'm a history nerd and was even so at that age. And so this was a really memorable experience for me. On the way, we stopped by Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and toured the Civil War battlefields there. And in D.C., we visited many of the popular spots like the Jefferson Memorial, the Lincoln Memorial and the National Mall, Ford Theater. We got to spend a few hours at the Smithsonian Museums, which is not enough time. And we didn't get to tour the White House or Capitol Hill. The Washington Monument was being renovated at the time. So there's so much more that I haven't done and see there, so I'm just going to have to go back, hopefully before John's in 8th grade. But there are many more notable landmarks throughout the country, throughout the world, and I love finding them and seeing them. I love seeing the landmarks here in the Detroit area, even, or especially the minor ones. Do you ever stop to read historical markers? There's one just a couple miles away from here. I bet the Frenches have seen. Clarenceville School District has a memorial historical marker. Clarenceville, you probably may not know, it predates Livonia. This tells us that the Clarenceville School District originated in 1837. Actually outlived Clarenceville, Michigan. There's a cool story about this. Landmarks and historical markers all tell a story of significant events that happened where you are standing. Even if you're learning about it for the first time, landmarks help you to remember the past and consider how it has formed and impacted your life today. Gilgal, Bethel, Jericho, the Jordan River. Those names might mean something to you. They're all notable places in the Bible, which would have had several historical markers and plaques, or even whole museums about what happened at those places. We're spending the summer learning from the prophets, and today we're going to be reading a story about the prophets Elijah and Elisha, and how they visited each of these places in one single day. Even more notably, it was all on the last day of Elijah's life, before he was taken up to heaven. So if you want to be turning to 2 Kings chapter 2, I'll also have it up on the screen, and I'll begin reading 2 Kings chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. When the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here, because the Lord has sent me to Bethel." But Elisha said, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. The company of the prophets at Bethel came out to Elisha and asked, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" "Yes, I know," Elijah replied, "so be quiet." And then Elijah said to him, "Stay here, Elisha. The Lord has sent me to Jericho." And he replied, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So they went to Jericho. The company of the prophets at Jericho went up to Elisha and asked him, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" "Yes, I know," he replied, "so be quiet." And Elijah said to him, "Stay here. The Lord has sent me to the Jordan." And he replied, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So the two of them walked on. 50 men from the company of the prophets went and stood at a distance, facing the place where Elijah and Elisha had stopped at the Jordan. Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up, struck the water with it, and the water divided to the right and to the left, and the two of them crossed over on dry land. And when they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit," Elisha replied. "You've asked a difficult thing," Elijah said. "Yet, if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours. Otherwise, it will not." As they were walking along and talking together, suddenly a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the two of them, and Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. And Elisha saw this and cried out, my father, the chariots and the horsemen of Israel!" And Elisha saw him no more. Then he took hold of his garment and tore it in two. Elisha then picked up Elijah's cloak that had fallen from him and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. And he took the cloak that had fallen from Elijah and he struck the water with it. "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" he asked. And when he struck the water, it divided to the right and to the left, and he crossed over. And the company of the prophets from Jericho who were watching said, "The spirit of Elijah is resting on Elisha." And they went to meet him and bowed to the ground before him. If we are familiar with this story, it is probably because Elijah was taken up to heaven in a fiery chariot, and that just doesn't happen every day. In fact, the only other person in the Bible who entered heaven without experiencing death first was Enoch back in Genesis. And that's pretty cool. But do you know what else is pretty cool? Geography and history. Maybe not to you. It is to me. And it was for Elijah and Elisha, and for God's people whom 2 Kings was originally written to. Over the course of this one day, these men traveled around 23 miles, nearly a marathon, visiting different landmarks in their area. And I'd like for us to consider today where God sent them and why God might have led Elijah there on this wandering journey home. And we begin at Gilgal. It is a name which in Hebrew means circle of standing stones. And it was literally a landmark set up by Joshua for the people to remember how God had allowed them to cross the Jordan River as it were dry land, just as Elijah and Elisha did themselves. And we first find Gilgal mentioned in Joshua chapter 4, where in verse 20 it says, "Joshua set up at Gilgal the 12 stones they had taken out of the Jordan. And he said to the Israelites, in the future, when your descendants ask their parents, 'What do these stones mean?' tell them that Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan what he had done to the Red Sea when he dried it up before us until we had crossed over. And he did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God." Gilgal was a place to remember, a time of transition and change, and how God was present through it all, both when they crossed the Red Sea and when they crossed the Jordan. And so how fitting that the transition between Elijah and Elisha began there at Gilgal in view of those 12 standing stones, which also marked the transition between Joshua and Moses, who could not cross the Jordan but died in view of it in the desert. Elijah knew from the beginning of this story that this was his last day. All the prophets did. It kept reminding them of it. Elijah likely would have been considering not just his life, but the legacy and ministry that he was passing on. From there, they traveled about 7 miles to Bethel. Remember last week when we read about how Elijah ran faster than King Ahab's chariots? I don't know if God gave him super speed again, but 7 miles is still a long way to go. Elijah tried to get Elisha to stay behind, but Elisha went too. He said, I'm sticking with you. Bethel means house of God, and it was a sacred site. It was there that Jacob had a dream of a ladder leading up to heaven with angels ascending and descending. And I can't mention Jacob's dream without showing a sculpture depicting it, which is a landmark on the campus of Abilene Christian University, where Blythe and I attended college. In this vision, God was at the top of the ladder, and he showed Jacob the land of Canaan, which he had promised to him and all of his descendants. In Genesis, we read, when Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head, and he set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it, and he called that place Bethel. Bethel was the site where Jacob's name was changed to Israel. And Jacob wasn't aware of God's presence at first, but it was revealed to him that the Lord was there in his midst. And for Elijah, it was yet another place to remember and to be reminded of God's faithful presence, especially in times of transition and change. The next stop on the journey was even further, about 11 miles away. And Jericho is likely a place that needs no introduction. It was once a mighty city with a famously impenetrable wall until Joshua and his army came by for a visit. Jericho was a landmark of victory, but not of Joshua and his army, but of Joshua's God. For 6 days, they marched around the city with the Ark of the Covenant without saying a single word, with only 7 priests blowing their 7 trumpets. But on that 7th day, they marched around 7 times, and when the priests sounded their trumpets one final time, Joshua commanded them, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. And they did. And those walls crumbled before them. And Jericho stood, or what left of it was stood, as a landmark of victory, not for Joshua, not for the Israelites, but for their God. Joshua had to humbly recognize that they could not win this battle. They were absolutely powerless. But with God on their side, Jericho had 0 chance. Jericho was a gift from God, and for Elijah, it was a reminder of who the real power belonged to. You know, Elijah was considered among the greatest prophets in history, and he accomplished so much in his life and in his ministry, but ultimately it was not about Elijah, but about what God did through him. And that was true, and it has always been true. The final destination was just about 5 miles away, the Jordan River. This place was even more famous than Jericho, mentioned around 180 times in the Old Testament and about 15 times in the New Testament. Now, the Jordan wasn't a mighty, beautiful, or amazing river, which we'll see next week when Naaman the Syrian refused to dip himself into it, considering it dirty. Well, but for the people of God, though, the Jordan was significant. It wasn't just the boundary to the promised land. Crossing the Jordan is often used as a metaphor for change and transition, but also for new life. It's no coincidence that Jesus was baptized in the Jordan River. Even centuries before that happened, though, Elijah would have seen how appropriate it was that God had taken him there before taking him home into eternal life. And it was there at the banks of the Jordan that Elijah finally found rest in the presence of God. But only after being reminded that God was present with him and his ancestors through everything, and with the comfort that God would continue to be with his successor Elisha and all future generations to come. This was the end of Elijah's story, but it wasn't the end of God's story. It continued on with Elisha, who picked up Elijah's mantle quite literally. It continued through the generations, and it continues now with us. We are part of the continual story whose author is God. We are living landmarks. We are in a landmark right now. This building is a landmark. It may not be Notre Dame Cathedral, but this is a landmark. Now, we've been doing a lot of renovation to this building lately so that it can continue to stand as a testament of what God has done through this church, which has been meeting here in this building since 1958. And as of this month, it has a new roof. And this week, we had the air conditioning fixed, which is great because I was breaking a sweat at the end of last week's sermon. We've got a new key system, and we're just continuing to update this. But as we look around this building, as we go around it, consider how many children have been taught in that education wing since we built it in 1964. And how many lessons have been given by generations of Bible class teachers, including some that were taught in those classrooms when they were children. A few weeks ago, someone who grew up at this church decades ago came back to visit, and he wanted to walk around, and he wanted to see this baptistry where he was baptized as a boy. He also remarked that the men's bathroom looks exactly the same, which makes me think that maybe it's next on the renovations list, because some landmarks don't need to be memorialized. Things have changed since the 1950s. They continue to change. And I know people don't always like that, because change means transition, and transition means uncertainty. And how do we know something is a good change? How do we know things that aren't going to get worse? There are reasons to fear transition, but as we consider the landmarks and the history that surrounds us, just like Elijah and Joshua and many others, we find comfort in knowing that God has been present with us, and God will continue to be present with us, and that in the end, any victories and successes belong to God, for it is by God's power that we are able to live in and live out God's story. And so we live without fear, but not without challenges. After Elijah was taken up, all eyes were on Elisha. He had huge shoes to fill. And Elisha must have felt a lot of pressure from the other prophets to continue that legacy of what had been handed down to him. He was able to make the waters of the Jordan part, just as Elijah did, which was enough to convince the other prophets that Elisha was a legitimate successor, but was it enough to convince Elisha? Now, I know this feeling. A little over 4 years ago now, I took on the mantle of preaching minister here from Larry Stevens, who carried it for 18 years. He and Diane are currently in Kenya, revisiting the legacy of their 23 years of ministry there in Nairobi. And I'm grateful, though, that they are coming back, that they're still with us, that God hasn't carried them off in fiery chariots. But just like Elijah and Elisha, I take comfort in the knowledge that I am not alone, that it's not about me, that all of us here are continuing on the legacy and the ministry of the Livonia Church of Christ, which will soon be in its 7th decade. The question we face is the one that we're faced with all the time, we have for years, is how are we going to do this? Where is God leading us? What rivers must we cross? What is God calling for us to do today? And what if we don't do enough? Are we going to succeed? What legacy will we give our successors and our children and grandchildren and future generations to inherit and to continue? I think about that a lot. When I beat Larry Stevens' high score record, and after I'm here for 19 years, what's the next person going to face? One day, God will lead all of us in this room home. And we will hand the mantle on to those who remain. And how do we know that they're going to succeed and continue the legacy? Are we preparing them enough? Will they be ready when that happens? These are questions that we must consider in the way that Elijah did, but we must also consider Gilgal and Bethel and Jericho and the Jordan. We must consider that long before we were here, long before this building was here, long after we are gone, God is present. Everything always changes except for that one constant truth. God is with us. And there are landmarks all over, testament and witnesses, living landmarks to this truth all around us. We are among them. We declare that God is with us. For this is the gospel we are preaching and the good news we are proclaiming, not just with our words, but with our lives. God is with us. God is present. God is leading us with unfathomable power, guiding us and inviting us into a story greater than any other story ever told. Do you know it? Do you want to know more? Because we would love to tell you about what God has done and what God in Jesus is doing, and to help you to see how God is already present in your life. Let us know. Again, we would love to tell you. And if you are in need of prayer and encouragement, and if God can be present to you through us, let us know. You can talk to me, to one of our shepherds, to one of our Stephen ministers, or to anyone, and we will pray and encourage you this morning. And in all things, may God and God alone receive all glory and honor and praise. Amen.